Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Chris Hattingh. Chris, how's it going?
Nicholas, always a pleasure. Good to be with you and Terence again. Let's get this week off on the best possible note.
Indeed. And of course, we also have Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, welcome. How are you today?
Well, so the week hasn't got off to the best start. Worldwide.
Well, there's a lot of things to talk about, as I'm sure all of our viewers can attest to. If anyone has been watching the news over the weekend, let's see what happened. There were some debates about COVID. There was some court case. Oh, right. Europe is at war again for the first time in decades. And boy, oh boy, there's that famous quote by Vladimir Lenin where he said, there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And I think in the age of sort of instant communication, that might be days or hours in which decades happen. What we have seen over the last couple of days has been quite incredible in terms of how it seems to have shifted the world almost into a new era. So on Thursday, the armies of the Russian Federation launched what President Vladimir Putin called a special operation to what he said was denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. Ever since then, Russian and Ukrainian forces have been engaged in what seems to be full-scale conventional warfare across the territory of Ukraine. We've seen incredible images, airstrikes, missile strikes, battles on the ground between men with rocket launchers, tanks, battles in the cities. There seems to have been a lot of fighting, particularly around the Ukrainian cities of Kharkiv in the east, Kiev in the north, which is, of course, the capital, and Mariupol in the south. A lot of things have also happened beyond that. It looks like a gigantic new refugee crisis is beginning in Europe. We're seeing now something to the tune of 500,000 refugees have crossed the border already into Poland and Slovakia, heading to the west to escape the fighting in Ukraine. There are estimates that up to 5 million people might flee to the Western countries, particularly Poland, Slovakia, Germany, countries like that in the EU. Now, for perspective, the Great Migrant Crisis, I think, was 1.3 million or something, at least for Germany. I stand under correction there. This is orders of magnitude greater, so it's going to have a massive impact on the countries of Europe. We've also seen the harshest economic sanctions I think I've seen, and I didn't expect this at all. Going into this, the Russian Federation has been cut off from the international banking system. Its central bank has been sanctioned. I think some of the yachts of various oligarchs who are allegedly connected to Putin have been seized in various ports around the world. And this morning, Russia's currency, the ruble, dropped by more than 30%. And there seems to be a bit of a run on the banks. In fact, the Russian stock exchange is not even opening this morning, which is quite spectacular stuff. There's a lot of videos and reporting on what's going on in terms of the fighting on the ground. There's a narrative emerging that Russia's army is not performing as well as many military analysts expected, although it's very difficult to tell that because, as you can imagine, both sides are producing absolutely enormous amounts of propaganda right now. There's lots of videos and images flying around the internet, and it's very difficult to tell exactly what's happening because sometimes people are repurposing old videos or they're giving a new spin to footage that's just come out, but they're putting it in the wrong context. So that remains to be seen. But Terence, let me start with you. What do you make of this? Is this as big a deal as I've just said? What to you has been the most shocking developments of the past couple of days?
Well, I suppose this is a conventional war. This isn't an insurgency, and this is being fought within, let's say, one of the, or least on the periphery of one of the major economic zones in the world. Ukraine may not be in the European Union, but in many ways, this has an echo of the collapse of Yugoslavia. I'm old enough to remember when the Iron Curtain was coming down, and Yugoslavia was seen, even during the Cold War, as a relatively open East Bloc society. There's some wonderful things you can find on YouTube, advertisements for tourism in Croatia. Mediterranean, lovely people, cheap place for European holidaymakers. In fact, when I lived in Germany, the one couple I stayed at and met on holiday in Yugoslavia. And all of a sudden, this went from this lovely sort of quaint old world. Okay, it was communist, it was a bit repressive, but it was a place where you could have fun. And Yugoslavs used to leave. The large community in Germany who were sending foreign currency back. That was kind of. There were even university textbooks, I remember, which put Yugoslavia forward as an example of real socialism. This was the genuine article. This wasn't, Stalinism or anything. It was worker control. And then you started to see T-54 tanks rolling through neighborhoods, and guys in camouflage shooting at each other and playing for keeps. That I remember a German acquaintance of mine describing as the shame of Europe. That something like this could happen on that, in this day and age in that continent. Surely Europe had learned its lesson, and it took a decade for that to start receding, and then you had these flare up conflicts. That's only a decade away. I think maybe what makes what we're seeing now somewhat more jarring is that this isn't the consequence of ethnic strife within a multi-ethnic state falling apart as rival nationalisms assert themselves. This is one of the largest militaries in the world. In fact, this is the successor to the great Soviet machine that held the world in awe for many decades. I think it shows that real wars are still possible.
I think that's exactly right.
Very, very concerning. Funnily enough, over the weekend, I exchanged a sort of satirical series of WhatsApps with a school friend of mine who now lives abroad. We were both very keen amateur military historians, and I said, "Can you imagine if this happened in 1984? We would have been salivating over it, And the big issue would be who got to play the Ukrainians and who got to play the Russians at break." Well, now that's here.
So, Chris, you were suggesting some interesting thoughts about how this may have changed some of the debates we've been having over the last couple of years. What are your thoughts on this?
I find it sort of funny reading some of the analysis and trying to make sense of everything sort of behind, for example, Putin's motivations. Our colleague Gabriel Krause has often pointed out how polling indicates that the Russian people are very much against war and sort of aggression, that kind of thing. And then one wonders for how long then Putin can sustain his sort of iron grip, as it seems to be from the outside. As always, we're commenting on something that we don't have intimate, immediate sort of experienced, sort of that tangible feeling of. But I do find it interesting how Putin might well win this war. It seems like the last few days especially have been quite difficult for the Russian forces, but through his own actions, he has in just about 4 days overturned the policy that Russian leaders have pursued for 75 years, which is basically to keep Germany weak, distracted, and disarmed. And Germany is now talking about arming again, talking about possibly exploring forms of energy that they ruled out completely now, especially in terms of nuclear. I wonder what this is going to now mean for other European countries and the sort of renewable push, as it were. And then just the effect on the Russian people themselves, who talk about, I mean, South Africans have been subjected to all forms of government abuse in various forms for the last however many centuries, years, decades. But for the Russians and all the regimes they have gone under, what is happening now, and it's interesting, the strategy seems to have been with invading Ukraine, a sort of besieging of Kiev. But what's happening more broadly is a sieging of the Russian economy. So you've got the swift shutdown, the slamming of imports and exports, the freezing of foreign reserves. And it's almost like autarky is now coming to Russia. There were lots of photos this weekend, taking your point, Nick, where some photos might be older or not, but it seems to be lots of long lines at ATM machines now in Russia. And the bulk of the pain will be felt by the Russian people. There'll be more expensive imports, a much weaker ruble, higher inflation. Maybe the government will forbid some of those sort of oligarchs or more upper class people, wealthier people, from holding foreign currency. Maybe they're going to be forced to sell off that kind of thing. And maybe there's a certain government at the southern tip of Africa that's going to look at what they're doing in terms of exchange controls for their own policies that they might impose at some point. But yeah, all of this is simply to say that with wars and the movement of grand empires on the sort of world stage, it's people on the ground who suffer the most in terms of war. What I'm trying to take out of it, but I realize obviously I might be way too premature. It's only a few days into the sort of into the invasion, but the last while, I mean, ever since Fukushima maybe wrote his his book, he put himself in a bit of a hole there in terms of the ideas of the West and capitalism winning. The last while, we've had a lot of cynicism about the Western order, about liberal values, about democracy, individual rights, the rule of law, all this sort of thing. And people maybe gleefully reacting when that sort of order shows some cracks and starts to fall apart, which isn't to say it's perfect. I mean, no good ideology, in my view, should aim at utopia, because then you're just going to justify all sorts of abuses and incursions into civil rights as governments try to impose their version of utopia. But now that we've seen countries coming together trying to help Ukraine in various ways, pretty much doing everything short of sending convoys and regiments of troops marching across to the east of Europe, you do see a sense of shared values and importance and standing up to proper aggression and incursions into people's territories. So I do see that as quite gratifying. You saw lots of protests. Now one can cynically say, oh, great, people used hashtags and they stood in the streets of Prague and Berlin, and they showed their displeasure with with what's happening in Ukraine. But I do take some courage from that, and I do think that's important that people come out in their numbers in that way to showcase that they do still stand for something. How that shakes out eventually, of course, we'll have to see. But I am somewhat hopeful that maybe Putin has done more to bring people together who share values that they might not have acknowledged in the past just yet. But it actually shows that maybe the liberal project hasn't been as bad as some have sort of said.
So just kind of picking up on this point, there's been this idea for the past couple of years that Putin is a master strategist, that he is sort of, a great diplomat, military leader, whatever, that he's cunning, that he always knows what he's doing, that he's always ahead of everyone else, and that he never loses, right? And in fact, you even see quite a lot of praise from even some parts of the right, which are traditionally anti-Russian, for this. Trump has said as much. He said that Putin is very clever. Well, I think what we may have just seen is the collapse of that thesis. There was a lot of reason to believe that that was true about Putin until about a week ago. Putin had enhanced Russia's position on the world stage, I think, by a lot since coming to power. But now he's facing a very difficult situation. There does seem to be quite a lot of evidence prior to the invasion that Russians were not particularly pleased with the idea of military invasion, as you mentioned, Chris. But now also that Russians are taking to the streets and protesting the war and are very upset by it. There was a Russian tennis star who, playing in Dubai over the weekend, wrote on the camera, "No to war, please," after he won his game. And we're beginning to see all sorts of things that Russia would never have wanted in a million years happen. Both Finland and Sweden, which are not members of NATO, are suddenly talking about joining. Sweden and Finland have also closed their airspace to Russia and are sending weapons to Ukraine openly, blatantly. This is not something that happens. Sweden has long prided itself as being kind of almost aloof from global affairs as this diplomatic superpower. And yet now they seem to be doing things. So possibly the result of this war, even if Putin achieves a military victory in the next few days, is Finland, Sweden, and even Kosovo, which is not recognized by some countries in the world as being an independent country, but is recognized by the US and Europe, most of Europe at least, as being an independent country. These countries all may join NATO. And surely I don't think Putin, when he began this, thought to himself, yeah, no, the thing I really want to achieve here is push even more countries into NATO and strengthen the unity against me. Terence, your thoughts on that point? Do you think I'm right to maybe be seeing this as a bit of a loss for Putin?
Look, I think that the idea that Putin was insane and this has no logical backing reflects, to my mind, that a sort of inability to step through the looking glass and see it from his point of view. I think that he actually acted fairly rationally, and I think he made a big calculation that America is too demoralized and Europe is too pacifist. Now, you mentioned Germany. The Bundeswehr in the 1980s had a tank fleet, Leopard 2s. These are really good tanks, of something like 2,300. It was a formidable force, 12 divisions. Today, the Bundeswehr's tank fleet is about 220.
And they offered to sell South Africa some of those, I believe, in the arms deal, but South Africa turned them down for some reason.
Well, it's one of those things. Sweden, for all of its moral posturing, maintained a very large and well-equipped army during the Cold War. In fact, this idea that they were completely neutral, Swedish diplomacy was always very complicated. Olof Palme would go and march against America with the Vietnamese ambassador in Moscow, when the Swedish chief of staff would be heading off to Brussels for informal consultation with his NATO allies. In fact, they were at one stage regarded as an unofficial NATO member. But there was an official Swedish report on their military capability that said if Sweden was attacked, their military could defend one small part of their border for 2 weeks. That's it. So presumably all the Russians, or whatever other large territorial threat may exist, would have to do is use the other toll gate, and that'd be okay. The idea that you were going to have a war in Europe was just seen as insane. In a sense, it is. I mean, if all you're going to have is a smoky mess, why do you want to do that? I think when you're dealing with historical grievances, with nationalist claims, those assumptions don't always stack up. And I do think there is something to Putin's concern about NATO being on his border. It's not, to my mind, a justification, but I think it's something to factor in. And it's interestingly not just Germany that's talked about this. Shinzo Abe was on Japanese TV over the weekend, saying that they have to seriously reconsider their kind of prohibition on America keeping nuclear weapons on their territory.
Right, and just Japan. For context, Japan is the most anti-nuclear country in the world in many ways. Until very recently, if a Japanese member of parliament suggested that Japan should either host or develop its own nuclear weapons, they would be shouted down by the entire parliament. It was completely taboo. Yeah.
So there's a few takeaways. First of all, I think this has demonstrated that hard power still matters. In 2017, I actually attended a conference on middle powers, and this issue came up, and I sort of raised eyebrows by saying that actually having tanks and guns matters. You can throw your socialized healthcare or your arts funding project at a battalion of T-90 tanks, is probably not going to do much good. So I think in that sense, we are perhaps heading towards an era of armed truce. But remember, that comes with costs. A lot of people around in the developed world have become frustrated with the limits on their livelihood prospects. This isn't America today is not the America of the 1950s, which was booming, and where everyone's dad was a Normandy veteran, so you would take up those cudgels. People criticizing Tucker Carlson for his comments, bear in mind that maybe those arguments actually work for a decaying town in Ohio. Why should what does it really benefit us to go and fight against Putin? The other thing I think is that for all the sunflower avatars and blue and yellow hashtags I've seen, the big question I want to ask is, okay, what do you want serious countries to do here? If it is sending in the 2nd Marine Division, that's fine, say it. But I see a great deal of posturing. We stand with Ukraine, but no to war. I think standing with Ukraine kind of means you take sides on a war. Now, maybe selling weapons or donating weapons is the thing to do. Maybe that's a halfway point. I know there was a great deal of resistance to that, even when Russia chewed up Ukraine's eastern regions. And I think maybe and just bring us to a conclusion, maybe what Putin is banking on is that ultimately there is not sufficient stomach for a fight to go over that line. And I say watch the Baltics very, very carefully. I suspect his long-term goal is to split and neutralize NATO. And perhaps, in 5 or 6 years, voters in Germany or in Italy or in Greece or wherever might decide that Latvia is not worth risking a major war for. And maybe you just have to accommodate yourself to a new reality. Maybe in America, that's not really willing to put farm boys from Texas and Wyoming, to defend the Rhine, is going to say, well, you deal with it. You're the wealthiest countries in the world, some of the wealthiest countries in the world. Maybe Russia falls apart over this. Maybe I'm completely wrong. Maybe the Russians themselves have aspirations to peace and prosperity or whatever that actually doesn't involve T-90s rolling into Ukraine to fight a war on a national claim.
So I think one of the things to look out for, and I'm probably going to write something about this later in the week on the dailyfriend.co.za, is that what we may have seen here is the reemergence of Europe as a major player in world powers. Up until now, the European Union and Europe has generally kind of decided to take a sort of backseat. It's been very content to sit and stew in its own decadence and kind of sort of slow but comfortable decay. At least that's my impression of it. And now, in the space of a few days, we've seen Europe go from being sort of almost entirely pacifist to being extremely militarily aggressive. I mean, I don't think I would ever expect. A lot of parliaments in Europe are beginning to consider legislation to allow volunteers to cross the border to fight in Ukraine. This is not the Europe of last week. This is a different continent. And we may very well see that Europe does, in fact, break away from America now. Not because necessarily that it's moving towards China or Russia, but because it's decided to do its own thing. Obviously, it's very early in the day to say whether this is going to be a permanent change, but it's definitely something to keep an eye out for. Any final thoughts, Chris? And then I'll go to you, Terence.
Yeah, just interesting to see what might happen now with China and Taiwan. So some theories, of course, that China will use this bit of instability to move a bit there, maybe increase some of their incursions into that airspace, or maybe even something further, and to see how the South African government is going to bring in a localization master plan so we can manufacture semiconductors in South Africa instead of importing them. And then just a final point on our ruling party, they released a statement yesterday that they're concerned by the rapid escalation of conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and I quote, "Since the ANC remains committed to its founding values of a struggle for a humane, just, equitable, democratic, and free world," end quote. And in all of that, not condemning the invading country and president at all. So it says all I think one needs to know about the ruling party and their moral compass.
Terence, any final thoughts?
Well, ruling party and moral compass are not words that I think fit easily into the same sentence. I think that what needs to be borne in mind here, and as I say, I'm not entirely, I wouldn't say unsympathetic, that'd be the wrong word, but I'm not entirely neglectful of let's say the official Russian perspective on this. I don't think that Europe and America have handled that situation well since the 1990s. But I think ultimately there's a question of whose tanks are rolling through whose real estate. And if and if the call is, well, let's negotiate and mediate at the Security Council where Russia can veto it anyway. No, it's worse than cynical. It's insulting.
Indeed. Anyway, we've got a few minutes left, so let's move back to South Africa so we can talk a little bit about what's going on here. Chris, this is something you wanted to talk about, and I think it's quite important for the finances of the country. We've gotten news, I think, today that the Constitutional Court has ruled against a private sector trade union, against the public sector trade unions, who are attempting to get the South African government to honor a wage agreement from 2020, which would have put the government on the hook for an additional 75.6 billion rand in back pay and an additional 37.8 billion rand, I think, going forward. The Constitutional Court ruled that this wage agreement bill was not budgeted for properly by the Treasury, and that this was indicated during the bargaining process, and therefore the agreement is not valid now. So in other words, government is not on the hook for this approximately 100 billion rand bill. Chris, your thoughts?
Oh, so along with the state of the SOEs, the state of South Africa's government debt to GDP ratio is often cited by rating agencies as of major concern, and that trajectory was always highlighted as impacting greatly on economic growth, because as tax revenue declines, the government simply takes more of that, but it's not spent very effectively or an actual service delivery on the ground. It's spent on sort of fancy pie in the sky ideas, summits, and plans. Interestingly enough, in the judgment, there was a line where it said the state has expended a huge sum of money at the expense of poor citizens in adjusting and paying out salary increases to public servants for the period of 2 years under an invalid collective agreement. So if you want the state to do something, at least focus on basic service delivery instead of providing exorbitant salaries to public servants who one could argue are not delivering at all. Bang for that buck. So I do consider this a good thing, at least for the time being. I will say, in terms of sort of predicting or risks or that kind of thing, just look out for possible union strike action now in the next week or two and how they handle this news. They might use that sort of disruptive methodology to simply get other concessions out of government. But at least government now has this on their side. Let's see if they actually stick to it and use it to keep South Africa on a bit of a better fiscal path. The debt to GDP ratio was expected to peak at 75% in 2024-25. So that's from last week's budget, from the budget speech by Minister Gordon Ngwana. So let's now see if it sticks to that sort of target and trajectory, and then maybe there can be some scope for limiting government spending in some areas and more private sector growth and job creation coming in others. So a little bit of a ray of hope early in 2022, where maybe there isn't a lot to look forward to in the next few years for South Africa, but let's see.
Terence, any final thoughts on this before we close up today?
I remember attending a conference on local government where Jill Marcus, who I think was the deputy finance minister at the time, this is back in the 90s, put some numbers on the table and said, we are spending so much on housing and we are spending so much on servicing our debt. We have to turn those figures around. And to all credit, the ANC under Mbeki, and there are numerous things that you could say about the pathologies of Mbeki's administration that took that seriously. Now we are wading into a slough of debt. Someone once said something about pre-approving our grandparents' credit cards so that we can spend it. He was talking about America there, but it's a good metaphor, and I think it works. I think unless we start taking this seriously, this will be something that will be with us for generations. That being said, ultimately, South Africa's problem is not so much what we're spending, but the wealth we are failing to create. The whole question, I think, is often reduced into, I think, really side issues. Is the state too big? Is the state too small? It wouldn't really bother me if every third person in the country was working for the government, provided we were generating enough wealth to pay for that, and we were all getting wealthier. But to a far too great an extent, our public sector has functioned as a sort of welfare net. It doesn't matter whether it's public or private or private sector, whether you have a big state or a small state or whatever. There has to be some reason for engaging these people. Otherwise, the system cannot long endure. Abraham Lincoln.
Indeed. All right, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you very much for listening. We hope that you enjoyed the show. Please subscribe to the channel if you are not already, and please like the video if you enjoyed it. Anyway, with that, we shall see you tomorrow for the Daily Friend Show. We will be once again talking about what's going on in the news, and I'm sure we'll once again be talking about what's going on in foreign affairs. Anyway, thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow. Cheers, everyone.